And we are very, very lucky to have Francesca Ritson to give our presentation tonight. And she's going to share her screen with us. And this is about fruit trees, primarily apple or everything, Francesca?
Everything.
Cool. All right. Well, I say take it away.
Okay.
Thank you for being here.
I think everyone can see the screen.
Everything. Stone fruits are kind of testy. Cannot graft peach trees like you would an apple or a pear.
I can't quite hear.
Maybe we can wait until later for that question.
Well,
can you hold off for a while?
Everything, but peaches are kind of separate.
Yes, quite true. Okay, well, I'm just going to launch in and I will tell the infamous tale that you take 10 gardeners and you ask them one question and you get 11 answers. So please bear with me. I'm sure people do this really differently or, have better ways of doing it. And you're welcome to chime in because I know there's people here who have vast experience. So just chime in if you have something to say. And I'm just going to start out with the basics of collecting scion wood. And for those who don't know, I suspect we have a wide variety of people here with vast knowledge and little knowledge. So scion wood is the variety that you would like. And when you collect it, the best time to collect scion wood is before the buds swell. So you're looking at your tree and you want to make sure that it isn't blossoming or close to blossoming. And it could be January, you could collect it in February. It sort of depends on the weather and it sort of depends with global climate change. It will depend a lot on the weather, but you try and hit it before it has those big fat buds on it. And I'll show you a picture of the buds later on. And you try and get a terminal shoot from last year's growth. And you want to cut the wood with well-developed, narrow-pointed vegetative buds. And I'll show you what that looks like too, not the round, plump, scaly flower buds. Disinfect your shears between trees and water sprouts can be used. You try and select disease-free scion, exposed to good sun last year, up to 3/8 inch in diameter. But sometimes if you have a really rare tree, you will just take whatever you can get off of it. And this is a picture of the leaf buds or the fruit bud right here. You can see they're fat and they're scaly. And over here in this corner, this is a leaf bud and you can see what it looks like. And this is called a new growth collar. So quite often you will be looking for that collar to tell whether you can cut the tree or not. These are really old pear buds and they tend to get very layered. And that's just a picture of the fruiting tree. So cutting wood. What is the best wood for scion? It's usually 1-year-old wood, disease-free, water sprouts are okay, cut while the tree is dormant. And generally you want it to be, it's described as pencil width. And that seems to be the best for most fruit stock. And that gives you the best chance to match up with a host tree. If you get a nice long piece, then you can also cut from the piece to match your rootstock. And you want to make sure the wood is disease-free and alive. So this is a picture of water sprouts. These are okay to take. These will be pruned out anyway. So if you're pruning, you can definitely use what you pruned. This is the growth collar in here. And this should indicate, you can see sometimes you'll get a long straight branch. And what you want is to not get the second year. This will be 2 years old and this will be 1 year old. So you want to cut it somewhere around here so that you're getting the 1-year-old wood. And usually the new growth has no fruit buds. Sometimes they do, but it usually does have a terminal tip to it. And how do you know if it's dead or diseased? If the scion wood is completely brown and it has no cambium layer, which is green, it's dead. Wrinkled bark or black color on the bark may mean it's not healthy or it's got a disease. Lesions mean it's unhealthy wood, and don't collect any of those. This is a picture of lesions. Don't want these. This is a picture of a lesion, and this is a little bit of death in here. So you don't want to collect these ones. This is a completely dead branch. You'll see it's completely brown, whereas these have a little bit of green and they're still alive. So you really want to look at your tree quite closely and see what's going on with it. Try to match the same thickness of the scion on the rootstock. That's really pretty important to successful grafting. And if you get a good match, you'll probably be successful. Disinfect the scion wood and preserve it until it's ready for grafting. So you seal any cut ends with grafting wax, paraffin, or beeswax. Other people use latex paint. There's a wide variety of things people can do. I like to make a bleach solution of 9 parts water and 1 part bleach, and briefly dip the scion in that, and then shake off the excess bleach and dry it with a paper towel, rinse it off. And not everyone likes to use bleach. I know a lot of people have bad images of it or think it affects the environment. Usually when you're doing the bleaching, you just use a little bit in a narrow container, and after a few days, if you leave it outside, it the chlorine basically gases off. So, but there are alternatives if you're interested in alternatives. Then you take the ones that you've processed and you bunch them all together, like varieties, in 1 bundle each. Label a piece of scion by wrapping it with painter's tape, leaving a tag on which to print the name, and use a Sharpie or another permanent marker, or rubs off, and you're left with a bundle of twigs, which are perfectly useless. So bundle like varieties together with a rubber band, place in a sealed plastic bag with a moist paper towel. Place the bundle in a plastic bag and a few sprinkles of water or moist towel. Seal the plastic bag and place it in the refrigerator. Your refrigerator should be 35 to 40 degrees is best, but don't let it freeze. Do not store with ripening fruit. I'm not sure that that isn't an urban myth, because I store it with ripening fruit and it doesn't seem to affect it, but I'm not sure about that. So it's best not to, because it's producing ethylene gas, the fruit are. And just check periodically to make sure that the scion is still moist. You should be able to see a few droplets. You don't want it too moist, because sometimes you get mold in there if you let it get let it go too long. So be sure of the variety when you mark it. It's very helpful, and quite often there are things that end up as mislabeled. So in order to keep these to a minimum, be sure of what you're giving people. And if it's an old heirloom and you just like it, you might just put it, well, usually you don't take them to shows, but if you want to reproduce them for yourself, then just put what it is, what you think it is, or what you it's your grandmother's or something like that. And don't take scion wood from below the graft unit or sprouts from the ground. This is generally rootstock, and it's probably not a good eating apple. It's not what you want. So, and again, don't take scion that are diseased or dead. Labeling is very important, oddly enough. So you want to, if you're really, really good, you will label each piece with masking tape for the scion exchange. And if you're just sort of generally good, you put 1 in there with the bundle, and label that with a permanent label after grafting. Update and locate on a plan of your garden where it is. Use a permanent Sharpie for longer lasting label in the plastic bag, and etch a name on a metal tag for permanent placement. Setting the location on the plan of the orchard helps when all else fails and all your tags have fallen off or faded. This is a homemade label made out of, one of those aluminum baking pans with some sort of tie from garden produce or something. This isn't really recommended because that you can already see that this is already rusting up here and it's too small. So eventually the branch will grow out and you have to keep releasing these to make sure that they don't get absorbed into the branch. It's actually harder than you think because some of the labels, this is a label on just plain old masking tape that is completely worn off. I have no idea what this is anymore. Okay, so the tools you need for this are just basic clippers of some sort or another, hopefully sharp, hopefully clean, 10% bleach solution, or sometimes people use rubbing alcohol or scrubbing bubbles, which is a disinfectant for your bathroom, which I only use for, Lowell loved this stuff. He had these studies that showed that, it was the best, the most efficient disinfectant there was around. But I would never use it in my toilet. It's good as a disinfectant for your shears. The labels of some kind or another, masking tape, plastic bag, twist ties, moist paper towel. And this is just sealants for storing the scion. When you cut your scion, you want to dip it in grafting wax, beeswax, paraffin, or latex paint, something that will seal the end, and then you dip it in the bleach solution because the bleach solution is very drying.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So do you sanitize the scion before you apply the wax or after?
After.
After, okay, thanks. So you're not really exposing the cut end of your scion wood then to bleach, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
You'll
Thanks.
probably cut the ends off anyway, but that's not to.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll just leap into grafting. Okay. Grafting in a very brief history of fruit trees and how they uprooted themselves and traveled around the world. It's actually kind of amazing. This is a great picture of all the different grafts you can make. This was made in the 17th century. And it just shows like a ton of different grafts. We use a lot of them still today, so it's kind of interesting. So basically what grafting is you want to attach a desirable variety of scion onto a rootstock. And the rootstock gives you different qualities, such as height, maybe better suited to your climate, soil, or be more disease resistant than the scion. This hopefully produces a much better tree composed of the two components. And people were grafting trees before the birth of Christ. There's just a long history of grafting. And if you're wondering where your apples came from, probably Kazakhstan. And there's still wild apple orchards there. Most of them are not terribly wonderful, but they're apple forests. And the pear may have originated in China. These trees probably traveled the Silk Route to get their way to Europe. And then from Europe, they brought them over to America. And both the Spanish brought some for the missions and the English brought them mostly to the East Coast, but they didn't really get over to the West Coast until the 1847. This is me down here. This is almost, it's over 100, 150 years old, more than that. It's getting close to 200. And you can see how tall they were. These are the pear trees in the Shelton Orchard. These are also very old trees, probably 150 years or so. And again, you can just see compared to this house, how big these trees were. And they're grafted trees. There's still rootstock coming from the bottom, and they produce good fruit from the trees. and they've been there just a heck of a long time. So we now use the scion. Sometimes it goes back 500 years. It's kind of amazing to add to a rootstock. And you want to choose the rootstock according to what you need. That's sort of why buying a tree from a store is sort of chancy, because you don't know what kind of rootstock it is and whether it's good for your soil or not. They hardly ever actually list what the rootstock is. The rootstock itself probably won't produce a particularly edible fruit. So if it doesn't make it, you can try and regraft it, or some of them, I'm told some of the bud 9 makes a nice cider, but they're not particularly eating apples. They're really bred for their size, which can be small, dwarf, semi-dwarf, or standard size, and for what kind of soil that they do well in. So they're also chosen for important benefits like disease resistance, and there's a number of diseases that they are resistant to, some of them, or make the tree more resistant. And your choices. So how big do you want your tree to be? A lot of us are going for a lot smaller trees because they're much easier to maintain. And as you can see, the ones that are 150 years old are almost unreachable and are very hard to manage. So I sort of like this little graph because it shows, you know, the amylite. This is for pear, and pear is one of the unusual ones in that you can use other trees besides pear rootstock for grafting onto, and you can use amelanchier, or you can use quince, and the quince pear stock, and there's all sorts of reasons why, and we'll get into that a little later. But pears are extremely tall trees, so you do want to kind of keep them smaller, or they just get away from you. And when I don't have any of this memorized, and so I'm just sort of reviewing this with you, but your rootstock choices you can easily find on the web and find out more about what they actually provide for you. And that's probably a good idea if you're thinking about purchasing something. And I like this chart because it also shows that various people, sorry, I'm looking at the entry thing, various trees, varieties will have different sizes of, make different sizes of trees. So for instance, if you use a bed 9 and you put it on a bramley, let's say, it will grow 6 feet. But on that same bud 9, if you put on a russet or a mock pink, you're going to have 7 feet. And if you put on some of the even more vigorous growers, they'll be slightly smaller. So that will affect your spacing, but it will also affect how tall your trees are growing. And you'll notice if you have some older trees that they are different sizes. Some of them stay quite small and some of them grow very large.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Reed had asked this in chat, and I just want to make sure. So the bud 9 would be for the smaller size for apple trees?
Yes, it's on
Okay.
the smaller size.
Thanks.
And another consideration when you're grafting is the pollination timing. And a tree that pollinates another one is, well, it's called a pollinizer. The pollinators are actually the bugs that come and pollinate your tree. And so you sort of want to know if you're only going to have a couple of trees, when their season is, so that they can be pollinizers for another tree. If you have a lot of trees, it probably doesn't matter, except that some of them are definitely what's called a triploid, and they are sterile. And some of them are self-fertile as well. So there's a bunch of different things, considerations, and you might, if you just have a few, want to consider whether they will be pollinating each other or not. Now, you're likely to have a lot in your neighborhood anyway, but it's useful to know if you only have a few. And then the ripening order. So when you might want them to ripen. And there's a whole series you can start in, well, probably, I'm not sure that ours really ripen in August so much as early September. Mine do anyway, mine are later. But anyway, if you're looking for something, I know like for school gardens, you look for things that will ripen in October so the kids are back. And you might want a series of apples instead of just having an apple that they all ripen at the same time and you have to do something with them. That's always a big problem when they all get ripe at one time.
I'd like to, I'll echo a question here that Reed asked. An earlier diagram claimed that red flesh, is it in general smaller? So therefore a pendragon and a red devil would be generally the same size on the same rootstock?
Well, that's a pretty good generalization. I mean, if it's true that that's so, then it would be so. I mean,
May I jump in on this one?
Sure.
I grow a lot of red fleshed fruits, and it depends on how vigorous the scion is. If you have a very vigorous scion for, say, a Calais, it will grow as much as 5 to 30 feet taller on the same rootstock as perhaps a rose surprise. So
I think
it
in
depends
general
on
that's
how
true.
vigorous the scion is if you're choosing the same rootstocks.
Well, it's more likely how vigorous your tree is, because I have Comice pears, and it's a very vigorous tree, and it always grows
Precisely.
vigorously. But the Seckel is a naturally small tree, and it will stay small. So I think you could probably tell from the tree itself, but if you can't see it and you're just getting scion, that would be a whole nother generalization. So
she was asking if you graft red to red on the same rootstock. So if you were to graft a Seckel or a Calais onto an old Farmingham 87, your Seckel would be a smaller, mature tree than your Calais because it is a much more vigorous scion, even though they're on the same rootstock.
oh yes, that's correct.
So that was answering her question. She said, would the smaller fruited reds be the same size on the same rootstock? And it's not the size of the fruit, it's how vigorous the variety is.
Right, that's correct. It's the tree
clarify
itself
her
and how
question.
vigorously it grows. It's not the fruit size. I have some tiny tree fruit. Well, you know, it's funny. I never thought of that as being a correlation, but the Seckles are small pears. And the Comice is a huge pear, but I don't know if there's any correlation there or not, to tell the truth.
There isn't. I also grow the little goat herders, which are about the same size as the secondary Anjous or the Seckles, and they are very vigorous tree and very small fruit.
Interesting.
Yeah. So
Thanks for the
also a red.
question.
okay. So to better understand grafting, it's useful to understand the physiology of a one-year-old tree. And the most important part is where the cambium layer is. And this is a sort of close-up look. The cambium layer is where it's called a cell generator. And that's what's producing the cells that make it grow fatter, widthwise, and taller. And that's the active layer. And why do you want to know this? Because you want cambium to cambium contact in any graft, and it's best achieved by the same year of wood. So both the same year from the cambium to the scion. And hopefully your cambium will match up in the rootstock and the scion. The cambium is where the growth is taking place and will knit together the graft. And you want a live cambium layer. These are different colors of different scion wood. So, and this is showing a terminal bud. This is what you're looking for in 1 year wood, is no growth ring and these small buds. These are leaf buds and a terminal tip. This is a bud 9 or red fleshed apple, and it's actually got red in the inside of the wood, which is kind of interesting. And this is just a plain old green wood scion, and this is dead again. So if it turns out brown, look at it and just make sure it's not brown and it's not diseased. And selecting scion, if you're lucky, you want to get the lower 2/3 of a scion wood, if that's possible. And it's more likely scenario is that you will find a scion that fits your rootstock. So you sort of want both of them to get both of them at the same time so that you can match them up. And sometimes you really don't have much choice, but just look for healthy live wood. The longer it is, the more choice you have of where to cut it in the twig. And what kind of tools do you need to graft? Well, basically a grafting tool, some sort of grafting knife, handy cut tool. Jean knows this because I got this from her. It's a great tool. Box cutter or other grafting tool, rubber grafting bands, electrical or other tape, grafting tape, film, labels, finger guards, scion, rootstock, and pots. So labels, these are the aluminum, oops. These are the aluminum labels. They're called impresso tags. You can get various ones for online, and you can just use a dead ballpoint pen. One of the uses for those many useless pens you have hanging around. You can make them out of old pens. The thing is, if you buy these impresso tags, they come with some awful little twist tie that immediately rusts. So I would get something else. I use these sort of plastic coated twist ties, and they come in rolls, and they're much more permanent, but not entirely permanent either. This is the handy cut tool or grafting knives. There are a bunch of different choices for grafting knives. The handy cut is really nice. If you grew up with knives and are really comfortable with them, grafting knives are great. If you didn't grow up with knives and you're not really all that secure about cutting, use the handy cut because it doesn't involve anything that is near your fingers until you get to another cut. And they're very fast, they're very sharp, and they do incredibly well. So this is my grafting knife sharpener. These are finger guards made out of old canning lids, made out of museum board. These are budding bands. They're elastic rubber bands that you tie the scion to the, oops. I think we raced through part of it. Okay. This is parafilm, which is the sort of stretchy tape that's used actually usually in medical profession. Oops. So if you cut yourself, you're allowed to wrap yourself up in parafilm and take yourself off to the doctor. I think Lori did that one time. So it's a very useful item. And a little sharpening tool to sharpen up your blades. I think.
Francesca, you mentioned a finger protector.
Yes. I'll show you later. It's coming up.
Okay,
You'll
great.
see. And there's a ton of different types of grass. The ones we most normally use are the whip or the whip and tongue. And actually, the other ones are interesting. And one of our past presidents urged us to learn different grafting techniques and maybe try a different one each year. But the whip graft is about the simplest. You just cut on a diagonal and both pieces on the diagonal and piece it together. So that's basically down here. But the tricky part about this is it's hard to keep this in place. So we generally teach the whip and tongue grafting, and that has another cut. And as you can see right here, Jerry is using a metal ring to protect his fingers. And that's what the canning lids are. They just have a little hole in the middle, and you just stick the scion up through that. And basically when you're cutting down, you don't cut your fingers off. And that's the only dangerous part of all of this.
Great idea.
Yeah, it helps a lot. So joining the scion to the rootstock, you choose a piece of scion wood and make an angle cut at the area that matches the width of the rootstock and cut off the top to 2 or 3 buds ideally. Cut rootstock at a similar angle, cut down to the bottom of the cut. This is cutting right here down to the bottom of the cut, and up here you're cutting up to the bottom of the cut. And join the 2 pieces. You wrap that with the rubber grafting bands or wrap it parafilm, whatever works for you. Seal the top cut of the scion with wax or paraffin. So after you've joined this on, you want to seal the top and then label it. Binding the graft, and that's commonly, you can see Jerry using a grafting band here. And that's nice because it gives you a little bit of tension. It's sort of stretchy and it helps sort of bind tightly together. You'll see sometimes when you make a graft that there's little gaps in between, and you want to bind those together so that your cambium layers are matching up. And safety. Be aware where your tools are at all time. If you hug your arms close to your body and gently rock the knife into the wood, you'll find at certain times the wood will actually slip and your knife, it will start going in a much more easily. And when you feel that give, you want to be able to pull it out. So it's important to maintain a position where you're always in control of your knife. And you sometimes end up with a little wedge shape scion, which may or may not be useful to you. So just be aware. And how easy are various fruits to graft? Well, apples are the easiest. Pears can be slightly more difficult due to incompatibility problems between the rootstock and the scion. And this can be overcome with inner stems of a more compatible variety. And I'll talk about inner stems in just a little bit. Plums can be more tricky, and you may need to bug graft them in the summer. And other stone fruits also are more tricky and may need to be bug grafted in the summer. And they may sometimes take more easily with an interstem. So what is an interstem? Some rootstock will not accept all varieties. The current rootstock used for pears and all pear scion are not compatible. And you look at some of the old grafting books, and you see these discussions between these older men on the East Coast, and they couldn't agree which ones weren't compatible, but they did agree that some were incompatible. So the Camus pear happens to be a very good interstem material between quinces and pears, and even sometimes on pears between the pear and the other pear. Asian pears don't respond well to European pear rootstock, so you have to get a special rootstock for them if you can find it. Some varieties offer a specific quality, such as non-staking, but are too vigorous and need an interstem to make them smaller. So, for instance, I sometimes use M111 rootstock, which is great. It's very sturdy, but it's a big tree. And if I use a bud 9 as an interstem, it'll keep it smaller, but it'll have the hardiness. But that means you have to basically do a whip and tongue graft twice. And some interstems offer greater compatibility. So Adara for all stone fruits, including apricots, plums, and peaches, seem to have worked for Vashon.
Question about interstems.
Uh-huh.
Would you do those in the same year?
Yes. I mean, you can. I always do. You can graft a single stemmed, usually 1-year rootstock, or graft onto an established tree. Some existing trees will accept the new graft and some will reject the newly grafted material. There's no guarantees that your tree will like being grafted onto. A rootstock can accept multiple varieties of scion, but a dominant variety will probably take over. So when you see those 4-way trees, there's no guarantee that you will get all 4 of them to grow. Quite often, 1 or 2 dominate and take over the tree. Multiple varieties are a good way to extend the season in a limited space or be cross-pollinators for flowers if you just want 1 tree with multiple varieties.
Also, they fruit faster.
Yeah, they do fruit faster too.
Question.
I'd like to interject on that too. If you are grafting a couple of varieties on a tree, it's a great way to get your pollinator. Graft a single branch or grow a single branch that will pollinate your tree. You
Right.
get
Mhm.
all of your trees become self-fertile.
Right.
One question, are quince rootstock easier for pear and vice versa?
Are they easier for pear, did you say?
I'm reading the question from Reed. Reed, if you can clarify your question, please. Meanwhile, Anita asked, what rootstock works well for Asian pears?
I don't like Asian pears, so I don't know. Jean might be able to answer that one.
I haven't had any trouble putting them on regular European
Oh.
rootstock.
I've had all sorts
I
of
have
problems
found they
with
do great on Bartlett. Asian pears strike well on Bartlett rootstock. And they strike well if you want to use a quince and an interstem of commas, then you can put pretty much any pear on that. If you want a shorter pear tree.
Okay, thank you.
A lot of times they use Patilifolia.
Yeah, for as I say, I don't like Asian pears, so I'm not very up on what they do. I just have one on a branch. So planting out. Once you've done your grafting and you're ready to plant out, this is a traditional orchard and it's just spaced out and nicely planted. This is a more informal approach. It was traditional in the old days to have animals with fruit trees in with their animal pens. So they provided both shade and some fallen fruit for the animals. And orchard in the fall. This is pictures of Bob Hartman's nursery. So he did a lot of espaliers. That's pear, apple espalier. You can definitely train your trees to do these nice things if you have limited space. He did pear plum hedges. This is Lori Bracken's orchard, and she's doing cordon Belgian fence. So as you can see, she has these pear or apples growing on angles, and that's the cordon growth. And then she has ones growing in the opposite direction. And these nice bee it's called bee netting, protects the fruit from insects rather than having to spray. And this is oddly Jean's orchard.
Jean's old orchard, yeah.
Jean's old orchard. And she did a Belgian fence.
I still have that.
Yeah, it's nice. Yeah. So you can see that hers are branching off at the bottom, and this is where they were grafted. This is a palmette in a pot, so they're trainable to different shapes, and you can keep them in a pot, but it's not highly recommended. This is 1981 Espalier, and it's more freeform. Peach Espalier from the Vashon Island Fruit Club. It's against a southern wall, and you can't see it. I'm sorry I cut this off, but the top overhang, it's got a little overhang so that it's protected, and you can see it doesn't have peach curl, which is one of the things that makes it really difficult. I think we had a question about peaches, but it makes it really difficult to grow them here because they're so susceptible to the peach leaf curl. And even the ones that are not as susceptible still get them early on. So this is a nice solution. You can grow them over a garden gate. And this is just a little bit of fun stuff about grafting multiple varieties. So Sam Van Aken did I guess it's called an art project actually. And he grafted 40 varieties of stone fruit onto one tree. And I only have like 17 on my pear tree. So I think he's doing really well. And he called it a fruit cocktail tree. It's got beautiful colored fruits on it. It looks wonderful. I don't know how he maintains it. You know, it's hard to maintain multiple grafts because you have to make sure you don't cut them off when you're pruning. Okay, so the basic review, and it's basically, you know, not that difficult, and it's well worth a try. If you fail, try again, because I failed several times before being successful. And the most important part is the safety. So it's safety, safety, safety. Practice on bits of branches until you can cut a clean angled piece of scion to match a rootstock. And don't cheat and try and match the same piece that you cut off the same other piece, because they fit perfectly. So try it with 2 different branches and see if you can't get the cuts. And soon your eyes begin to create this pattern so that you can get the size pretty darn accurately. And make the cuts and cut a cleft from about 1/3 the distance of the diameter. And cut down, use finger guards to make these cuts if you don't feel like you can deal with a knife all that well. Even so, just for safety, we've only had 1 cut in our club's existence, and she admitted she was being rather hurried. So just try and keep things safe. Join the scion and the rootstock manually and wrap with a rubber grafting band or paraffin film tape, whatever works for you. You just want it to be sort of tightly bound and held together in a sort of binding fashion. Label them, plant in a pot with good soil or in the ground, keep watered for at least the first 2 years. And if planted in glacial till soil, you may be watering them forever. And that's it.
I interject on tools.
Yes.
I have very poor hand strength and I'm kind of shaky. So I use an Omega grafting tool. Grafting tools can be picked up at Amazon for $20. I love the Omega graft cut. You can do a V cut. If you angle it to the side, you can do a straight cross cut and do your whip and tongues. They're a wonderful tool. They give you a perfect, clean cut every time, and you can readily match that cut. and then you snip the tool with the tool and you wrap it with parafilm or a band, and they're wonderful.
Hmm.
If somebody is uncomfortable using a grafting knife.
Mhm. Great.
But I toss that in there. They're a cheap tool. They will easily cut as many scion and rootstock cuts as the average home grafter is going to do for years before your tool gets dull. And the replacement blades are terribly inexpensive.
And that was Omega?
I use an Omega grafter, but it's just called a grafting tool, and you can pick them up on the web. Again, check, just look up grafting tool. You can find them at, buy them on Amazon. You can buy them at Jay Leonard's. You can get them from Lee Valley Tools, but they want a lot for them. But
Yeah, that's what I like about the handy cut is I just use a new blade every year and just get rid of
that's
the old
exactly
blade.
what I do. It's just some of the grafting tools you can pick up on Amazon. It's actually cheaper at $20 to buy a brand new tool with a double set of blades than it is to replace your blades, because your blades will cost you as much as the tool, and they come with 2 sets.
Hmm.
Even if you only use the Omega or the V-cut, the V-cut's great because you can cut even tiny scions, because some plum scion is very small. And they also come with a T-plate, so you can cut buds for summer budding peaches.
Great.
They're marvelous little tools, especially if you're not comfortable with a grafting knife, or you have weak hands, or you shake. And
That's good
I
to
have
know.
both.
Yeah.
I graft
Thank
a
you.
lot.
Yeah. Thank you for those tips. So Francesca, you primarily use a whip and tongue for most
Yes.
everything?
Yeah, unless I have really tiny bits of scion, then I would just do the whip. And there's a question, how many years does it take before the graft fruits? Well, it can take anywhere from 2 years to 8 years, depending on what you have grafted. And you should, yes, you should remove the first year's fruit. Sometimes there's scion wood and it just has fruit blossom on it. Just remove it. I know it's really tempting. I think all of us have been tempted to just keep the fruit, but you really should get rid of it to both strengthen the plant, but also it's a weak point. So you want to let it sort of get tougher before you let it bear too much.
Let its
Should
strength
cut
go
your
into
fruit.
producing the roots and firming the connection between the
Yes.
scion and the graft.
Right.
Yeah. Cool. But the image that I sent out with the notice about this, I showed it a very different grafting technique. I didn't know that you primarily used whip and tongue.
Yeah, I mean, I've used that grafting technique, but it's a little more precarious because you put the chisel point in there and you have to find it was showing it going in, but it didn't show that you had to find the cambium layers. So you still have to match up the cambium layers, and then you have to put in grafting wax over the top of all that to seal the top. And you often get two, you often do 2 on either side. So I just like the whip and tongue. It's what I learned first and I got used to, but whatever works for whoever, it is the right technique for you. As I said, 10 gardeners, 11 answers. You just find what your preferences are and stick with it.
Yeah, a question about, you mentioned a cutter, a pruner of some sort. And I would imagine you'd prefer to use a bypass pruner rather than an anvil pruner so that you're not crushing where you might be grafting. That
Well, I just use my pruning tools. What I have is just, the regular old pruners. And you don't want to crush it, but on the other hand, you're probably going to cut it off. So it's waxed at that end. More than likely, you're going to look on your piece of wood to find the proper place which matches your rootstock, and you'll probably cut most of the stuff at the bottom, or sometimes you don't. It just depends what you end up with as scion wood.
questions.
Yeah.
Rachel
Uh,
says, thank you, Francesca. I learned a lot. I fall far on the beginner end of the spectrum as someone who has never tried grafting before.
Oh, you'll enjoy it. It's
addictive.
great fun. And then you get, hooked. So
Once you've made your first tree,
yeah.
that's a danger point. We will never stop after that.
And then you go to Peninsula's fruit show and you taste all those fruits that aren't grown commercially, and you get really hooked, because where else are you going to find that exotic tree?
And 10 years from now, you will have Franken trees like mine. I have a pear with 53 different varieties on it. And it's my mother tree because it's varieties that are hard to find. And the way you keep them viable is you never let that tree fruit. You only keep it growing scion wood.
Interesting. Huh. Very interesting.
That way, if you have a tree fail in your orchard, you always have a replacement scion.
Problem is when you have so many trees that you don't need a replacement. So probably Jean has gotten to that point. But she has Steve Butler, so
I've got 50 acres and hundreds of trees, so but I also survived the Oso mudslide, so I'm replacing trees.
oh
So you learn things.
Wow.
Like
yeah.
every tree should have its own pollinator.
You definitely learn things.
Yeah. Wow.
And there's another
Biggest
question.
thing for pollination for your trees is most people live close enough to other apple trees that even if you only have one apple tree in your yard and you live reasonably close to a handful of other people, the likelihood of a pollinator for your tree is pretty good. But pear trees, pollen doesn't spread that far. So your pear trees need to be within about 50 feet of each other. If your neighbors don't have pears, you need a pollinator for your pear. So it's easy to have one apple tree, but if you're going to have pears and your neighbor doesn't have a pear, get two trees or graft two varieties.
Mhm. Okay.
Range
Neat.
tips.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those tips.
There's no nectar in pear blossoms, so the bees don't like them. That's why it's hard to pollinate pear trees.
Yeah,
So-
it's interesting though. I have some old pear trees and they seem to have developed with a pollinator. And so there seems to be some sort of symbiotic relationship, and they quite often do get pollinated more than my apples are being pollinated, especially last year with the terrible weather. There are very little things that look like mosquitoes almost. And they definitely come out to pollinate the old fruit trees. They seem to
Older
be.
varieties of fruit and vegetables can be pollinated by native pollinators. It's just the modern varieties, we have changed them so much. Honeybees are from Europe. They're not native to the Americas. Most of our native pollinators don't recognize the modern varieties. And so, for example, cucumbers have to be pollinated by honeybees because our native pollinators don't recognize them.
Hmm.
You can cheat, and if you're having a year where it's very rainy or you're not getting a lot of pollinators, mix a little kelp or fish fertilizer and spray it on your blossoms. That will draw in the little aspid wasps, which are wonderful hoverflies, wonderful pollinators. But they have to be brought to the tree to recognize it first. Once they're there, this is food. But if it's a poor honeybee year, you can cheat. Squeeze them into your trees and then you're golden.
Okay,
I
see,
like mason bees, but they're only good for about 6 weeks. And if you have apples and pears and cherries and plums and gummies, you're wanting pollen from early spring when the native plums, the oso berries, are in pollen, all the way up to fireweed, which is where honeybees come in over mason bees. But if you have a tree that you're having poor pollination on, so just get a little fish fertilizer or a little kelp meal and mix it with some water and spray it on your blossoms.
is it the odor that attracts them, you think?
I don't know. I found that out purely by chance. I've always done foliar sprays, and I happened to do the pair of them. I usually do weeks apart, but I was being deployed overseas, and I was going to be gone. So I sprayed both the kelp and the fish fertilizer in the same week, and I got the most incredible fruit set off of those trees. Not the rest of the orchard, just the front of it.
Interesting.
So, and I've done that ever since. Anytime I'm like, oh, I'm not getting any pollinators on this tree, I'll just take a little hand sprayer out there and just spritz. Just seems to tell them the pollen is there. And once they recognize that it's there, they bring all their friends.
See the neat things we learn here?
The commercial guys that sell pollen do make some deals that attract bees. Called Bee Scent is one particular brand.
Oh, absolutely.
You also need to be sure
Fish
all the
fertilizer,
SLE.
you can use tuna.
You also have to be sure that you have different S-alleles in your trees. If you've got two trees that have the same set of S-alleles, they're not going to pollinate each other. I don't care whether the bees come or not.
What are SLEs?
Precisely.
That's a genetic
You
thing
get
in the
triploids
pollen.
that are self-sterols too. And some of the older varieties of pears are self-fertile too. So even if you don't get pollinators that year, you'll get fruit. Plums, there's a handful of plums that are that way as well.
Neat. Stuart, I think you were going to ask a question at one point. Did you ask your question to get your question answered?
Oh, well, I noticed Anita talked about Asian pears. I want to say my experience with Asian pears, the only time I got cut really bad with a pruning knife or a grafting knife, because that wood is brittle and the whip and tongue wants to split a lot. So you wind up doing a cleft. And the thing is, I have one big Asian pear tree, but I don't really like the Asian pears don't keep. It's a really high sugar variety, and so I've been trying to graft other stuff onto it, and excuse me, that's been a learning process of trying to do that graft, and then and it doesn't graft. Once you graft something to it, one of the buds from the side will come out and propagate. Won't propagate from the end out. It's just some characteristic that I never read about before, but I notice it happens.
Interesting. So now is the time that we should be collecting the scion wood for apples, for all varieties, or just apples mainly?
apples,
Apples,
pears.
pears, and plums.
Yeah. Some of I've noticed the peaches are already looking like they're about to bloom out. I don't know if they were fooled by some of the good weather we had, because then it got cold again. So I don't know. I mean,
Peaches are generally summer budded, so you don't really collect their scion now. But cherries, plums, pears, and apples are collect scion now because they are not summer budded.
Okay. Cool. Well, thank you, knowledgeable people everybody out there. Ooh, it's raining really hard outside.
oh, and you can also get quince this time of year.
Oh yes.
Right. Reed had questions about quince. Randy says mosquitoes are pollinators too. They mostly eat nectar. Only the females that are going to lay eggs drink blood. Yeah. The little hummers. Yeah. Neat. Well, other questions, comments? Thank you,
For
Francesca.
propagating other fruit, not
Pardon?
grafting, but now it's for propagating other fruits, not grafting per se, but if you wanted to propagate things like figs and grapes, now is also an excellent time to cut your wood for that and root them.
Ah, so I can root the pruned pieces of my grapes.
Yes, you can root grapes now. You can root figs now. You can root blueberries if you have bottom heat.
I wouldn't be pruning figs now, would I?
If you want to root them, yes, you want to prune them for rooting before the buds swell. So between now and March.
Okay, but just to prune a fig is now the time that I would also be pruning figs, regardless of whether I'm propagating or not? Anyone know?
Personally, I'd wait a month because you don't want them too cold. If you're still freezing hard, you don't want the tips where you cut to swell with the sap where it's trying to scab over. You shouldn't prune them until you have at least 3 days. Well, you shouldn't prune anything unless you have 3 days of non-freezing, non-raining weather in a row after you trim. Because you don't want to introduce disease. You want the tree to be able to scab over before it's exposed to either rain or freezing. Because when you cut, your tree wants to send sap to the tips, and then if it freezes that night, all that extra moisture in the tip will basically blow out the tissue in the end, and it's as likely to introduce disease.
The commercial guys would never get anything done if they waited for that. They prune the snow on the ground all the time.
Yep, they do. But they have lots and lots of trees.
Some of us do.
Of us do.
Yeah, like Francesca said, ask 10 gardeners.
Ask 5 people and you get 10 answers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Francesca, thank you so much. Very interesting introduction to grafting. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca.
Good job.
Yes, very good job.
Yes, thank you.
I liked your visuals.
Yes,
Any other-
thank you. It was an excellent presentation.
Any other questions about what you're doing or growing or want to grow?
If you want to find out about S alleles in pollen, go to furmanpollen.com and check on their pollen charts.
I'm going to ask you again for the name of the URL, Jean.
It's Firman Pollen, FIRMAN pollen,
.org
com.
or .com. Okay.
They have a good pollen chart there, and they have a nice explanation on the bottom of the chart of how the S alleles work.
Neat. Thank you.
And I've been compiling a chart. I've got 800 and some different varieties of apples now that I know the S alleles on.
Excellent, excellent resources, you guys. Good jobs. Well, other questions? Comments? Anything?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm curious, since this was a recorded meeting, will that be posted somewhere?
Yep, it'll be posted to our YouTube channel.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If everything goes right, you know, and I'm crossing my fingers.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, do I hear anything else? We could close the meeting here. I think I'll go ahead and stop the recording.